He went up into the mountains to clear his head after retiring, but what he found in the rock changed everything. The house, built right into the stone, had remained untouched for a century. Inside was a secret that connected 2 lives across time. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The house had grown too quiet for him to bear. Every morning began the same way. The hiss of the kettle, the creak of the old wooden chair, the slow rhythm of a spoon circling inside a chipped mug. Outside, the street remained still, as if the world had forgotten this corner of Denver entirely. William Bill Hanson sat by the window with his coffee, watching the faint trail of breath form and vanish against the glass. 50 years old, and already retired. He had spent 25 of them as a rescue officer, running toward the fires and storms everyone else ran from. Now, there was nowhere left to go. The silence was his new assignment. It followed him from room to room, thick as dust, settling over the furniture and photographs that lined the walls. In one picture, a younger Bill smiled beneath the weight of a helmet, soot streaking his cheek. Beside him, his wife Mary leaned in close, her arm around his shoulders, her smile bright enough to outshine the chaos in the background. Another photo showed a boy, 10 years old, gap-toothed, holding a fishing rod in triumph. That boy, his son Evan, now lived in Chicago, busy with his own family, his own world. Calls came every other Sunday, polite, brief, warm in tone, but distant in soul. "You doing okay, Dad?" "Yeah, son," always. The same exchange, always ending with a silence that said more than either of them could. When Mary died 5 years earlier, something inside Bill had gone with her. For months, he had thrown himself into work, volunteering for every dangerous call, every late-night search through fire or flood. It was the only way he knew how to keep moving, to drown the ache. But the body, like the heart, has its limits. After a back injury during a mountain rescue, the department offered him early retirement. "You've done enough, Hanson," they said. "You've earned your rest." Rest. The word had sounded generous at the time. Now it felt like a punishment. The days passed in a pattern too precise to matter. Wake up at 6, make coffee, stare out the window until the world brightened enough to walk a few blocks. Lunch at noon, a sandwich he barely tasted. Dinner sometimes skipped altogether. The evenings were the worst. The quiet pressed harder then, and the house, once filled with Mary's soft humming or the rustle of her pages as she read on the couch, felt hollow. He tried television, tried music, tried sleeping pills. Nothing dulled the feeling that he had somehow stepped out of his own life and left it running elsewhere. It was during one of those evenings, when the sky outside turned the color of old paper and the city's hum faded into the background, that he climbed up to the attic. The floorboards groaned beneath him, a tired protest, as if the house resented being disturbed. Dust coated everything in a soft gray film. Boxes labeled in Mary's neat handwriting, Christmas, kitchen, Evan's school things, stood stacked in careful towers. In the far corner, behind a broken lamp, was an old metal case stamped with faded letters. Rescue Ups 1998, 2005. He knelt beside it and flipped the latches open. Inside were fragments of his old life, a cracked radio receiver, some field notes, folded maps, a compass whose glass was scratched, but still functional. Beneath them lay a single yellowed sheet of paper, with coordinates scrawled in pencil, and a line that made his pulse quicken. Radio signal, 2002, house in the cliff. The handwriting was his own. He remembered now. A winter operation, bitter cold, wind sharp enough to peel skin. They'd been searching for a missing climber who had gone off route 3 days earlier. The signal had come faintly, barely audible through the static. I reached. The house in the cliff. Then nothing. The storm worsened. The search was called off, and the man was never found. For years afterward, Bill had wondered what those words meant. They'd haunted him, surfacing in dreams, always the same image. A dark opening high above a snowbound valley. Something ancient waiting in the stone. He'd forgotten it for years, buried it beneath paperwork and routine. But now, as he sat under the dim light of the attic, the phrase returned like a whisper carried by wind. He held the paper longer than he meant to, tracing the coordinates with a trembling thumb. The rational part of him scoffed. "You're chasing ghosts," it said. But another voice, quieter and older, answered, "You used to be good at finding them." That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay in bed listening to the clock tick through the darkness, thinking about the man on the radio, about how his last words had been half lost to static. Somewhere in those mountains, there was a story that had never been finished. He didn't know why that mattered now, only that it did. Maybe it was the emptiness of his days, or the need to feel something other than memory. Maybe it was because he had once promised Mary he'd stop risking his life, and now risk was the only thing that still felt real. By dawn, he'd made up his mind. The decision came not as a burst of inspiration, but as a quiet inevitability, the way the sun climbs a hill without sound. He made coffee, ate a piece of toast, and stood by the window until the first light spread across the rooftops. Then he went to the garage. The air smelled of oil and cold metal. His old hiking pack leaned against the wall where he'd left it years ago. He dusted it off, laid it open on the workbench, and began filling it with the precision of habit. Knife, flashlight, rope, first aid kit, a thermos, a folded map, batteries, a coil of wire. The compass he'd found in the box went into the side pocket. His hands moved automatically, each gesture rehearsed by decades of practice. For the first time in months, he felt a flicker of purpose. Before leaving, he went back inside, to the living room where Mary's picture still sat on the mantel. He rested a hand on the frame. "Last trip, Mare," he murmured. "I just need to see it." The road out of the city wound upward through gray hills and into the colder air of the foothills. The sky stretched wide and cloudless. Traffic thinned, then vanished. Bill rolled down the window and let the cold wind bite his face. The hum of the tires became a steady pulse, rhythmic, almost meditative. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed this, the sense of motion, of heading somewhere that didn't have a schedule attached. The mountains began to rise in the distance, jagged silhouettes against the pale horizon. With every mile, the world behind him fell away. The noise, the lights, the polite conversations. Here the air smelled of pine and stone. The closer he drew, the more the years seemed to peel off his shoulders. By the time he reached the small gravel turnout where the trail began, he felt lighter, almost younger. He parked the truck and sat for a moment, listening to the wind whisper through the trees. The same trailhead he'd once used during rescue drills was overgrown now. No footprints, no signs of hikers. He strapped the pack across his shoulders, tightened the straps, and started up. The ground was soft with needles, the earth dark and damp. His boots sank slightly with each step, the sound muffled. As he climbed, the forest closed around him. Tall pines, the occasional birch, the low rush of a stream somewhere below. The morning light filtered through the branches in broken shards, dappling the path. He moved slowly but steadily, keeping rhythm with his breath. Each step seemed to quiet the noise in his mind. Up here, there were no clocks, no reminders, no pitying voices asking how he was holding up. He reached the first ridge by midday. The trees thinned, replaced by rock and wind. The view below made him pause. The valley stretched out in muted greens and browns. a silver thread of river winding through its center. Far beyond, the faint haze of civilization lay like a forgotten dream. He took a deep breath, and for the first time in years, the air didn't feel heavy. As he rested, his eyes wandered along the opposite cliff face. Something caught his attention, a shape too straight, too deliberate to be natural. At first, he thought it a trick of shadow. But as the sun shifted, the outline persisted, a rectangle cut into the stone. His pulse quickened. He reached into his pack, pulled out the small binoculars, and raised them to his eyes. The details sharpened. The edges were smooth, precise, as though carved by hand. Dust and moss clung to the surface, softening it, disguising it from anyone who didn't look long enough. But there it was, undeniable. A doorway, perhaps even a roof jutting slightly from the cliffside. His breath caught. The memory of that old transmission flooded back. The house in the cliff. He lowered the binoculars, heart pounding. 20 years of silence, and here it was real. For a moment he simply stood there, caught between awe and disbelief. He could turn back now, pretend he'd imagined it. But he knew he wouldn't. He'd lived too long surrounded by ghosts to ignore the one that finally took shape before his eyes. The approach would be dangerous. The slope below the formation was steep, the rock unstable. Yet even as he studied it, his hands were already tightening the straps of his backpack. Every instinct honed by decades of rescue work came alive, measuring distance, reading the angles, planning handholds. The mountain loomed above him, ancient and indifferent, but he no longer felt small. He felt challenged. He moved carefully, testing each foothold, gripping the rock until his knuckles ached. Pebbles slipped away beneath his boots, clattering into the void below. The sound of them falling delayed, reminded him of how high he'd climbed, but he didn't stop. Sweat traced lines down his temple, mixing with dust. The wind whipped harder here, funneling through the cliffs, carrying the faint echo of his own breath. Minutes stretched into hours. The sun dipped lower, painting the stone in gold and rust. When he finally reached the ledge, his arms trembled from effort. He hauled himself up, chest heaving, and stood on a narrow shelf barely wide enough for both boots. Before him stood what he had only imagined, a wooden door, old but intact, set flush into the mountain itself. Up close, the illusion of nature vanished. The planks were weathered but deliberate, fitted tightly together. Bits of moss grew between them. There was no handle, only a faint indentation where one might have been. The air smelled faintly of resin and age. Bill reached out, hesitated, then pressed his hand against the surface. The wood was cold beneath his glove, unyielding at first. Then it gave slightly, as though the years had softened its hinges. The sound that followed was low and long, a groan from another century. A thin breath of air escaped through the crack, cool and dry, carrying the scent of dust and time. Bill leaned closer, listening. Nothing. No sound from within. The light was fading fast, the sky darkening into evening. He knew it would be foolish to enter now, yet he couldn't make himself retreat. He pushed gently, and the door opened a few inches, the darkness beyond it dense and absolute. The beam of his flashlight cut through it, revealing only a wall of shadow and the faint suggestion of space beyond. His pulse thudded in his ears. He took one step forward, the ledge steady beneath him, and whispered into the stillness. "Anyone here?" Only the mountain answered, with wind sliding along its stone. He exhaled slowly. "Guess not," he murmured. Then, tightening his grip on the flashlight, he crossed the threshold. The darkness closed around him like the mouth of the past. The air inside the opening felt thick and old, untouched by breath, for longer than he could imagine. As the door groaned closed behind him, the last thread of daylight slipped away, leaving only the dim beam of his flashlight cutting through a swirling haze of dust. It was cold in there, colder than the air outside, as if the mountain itself exhaled frost. Bill stood still, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom, and for a moment he wondered if he had stepped not into a room, but into another time. The silence pressed against his ears until he could hear the faint hum of his own heartbeat. He swept the light slowly across the space. The beam revealed rough wooden walls, fused directly into the rock, as if someone had carved out a hollow and sealed it with timber. The floorboards creaked faintly beneath his boots, brittle from age. A small table stood near the far wall, its surface scarred with cuts and blackened spots, as though someone had eaten or worked there by firelight long ago. Against the opposite wall was a bed frame. Simple, handmade, the mattress little more than a shapeless mound of cloth and dust. Everything was gray with time, yet still arranged, as if waiting for a life that had stepped out for a moment and never returned. He moved deeper into the room, the flashlight trembling slightly in his hand, despite his effort to keep steady. A single shelf leaned against the back wall, sagging under the weight of objects that hadn't been touched for decades. Rusted tins, a lantern so clouded with soot that its glass was opaque, and several small jars sealed with wax, their contents shriveled to shadows. A faded coat hung from a wooden peg near the doorway. He brushed it with his gloved fingers, and a small cloud of dust fell away like ash. Beneath the dirt, the fabric was heavy, wool-old, European in style, the sort of thing no American climber would have carried up a peak like this in modern times. He took another step forward, and the beam of his flashlight struck something unusual, a faint line drawn across the far wall in black. He leaned closer. The words, scrawled in what might once have been charcoal, were barely visible now, but they read clearly enough to make his breath catch. Don't look for an exit. Look for silence. He whispered the phrase aloud, tasting its strangeness. It felt less like advice and more like a confession. On the table lay a thick object half buried in dust. He reached out and brushed it off. A leather-bound notebook, cracked and stiff with age. The strap that held it closed, long since frayed away. His gloved fingers hesitated before opening it. The pages inside were brittle, stained by moisture and time, but the handwriting was still legible. A careful looping script in faded ink. The first page bore a date, April 1916. Bill's stomach tightened. 1916. He turned the page carefully, and as the light played across the paper, words emerged from another life. They are looking for me. The border has closed. The mountains are my refuge now. Below that, smaller lines continued, half in English, half in what looked like French or perhaps German, scattered with abbreviations and words he couldn't decipher. He read what he could. The air here is sharp. It reminds me that I still exist. The nights are longer. But the silence is loyal. He sat on the edge of the bed and turned another page, the floor creaking beneath his weight. The entries stretched across months, describing storms, loneliness, hunger, and something darker that lingered between the lines, a fear not of nature, but of pursuit. Whoever had written this had fled something more dangerous than the mountain itself. There were references to soldiers, to names crossed out and replaced with initials. He wrote of hiding supplies, of building a home inside the bones of stone. Bill closed the book and rested it on his knee, staring into the dark. A man had lived here, not visited, not camped. A man had built a life inside this hidden room. He imagined him sitting by that same table, the lantern flickering, writing these words with frozen fingers while the snow howled outside. Perhaps he was a deserter, or a refugee who crossed oceans and borders, only to find himself trapped again by history. Perhaps he had come here to disappear completely. The thought stirred something painful in Bill's chest. He too had come here, running from the dull ache of memory, from the guilt that followed him like a shadow. 20 years ago, during one of the wildfires, he had been too late. The roof of a burning house collapsed just before he reached the boy inside. For years afterward, he told himself there had been nothing he could do, that no one could have survived that collapse. But when he dreamed, he still heard the boy calling for help. He'd buried it beneath layers of professionalism and silence, just like this man had buried himself inside the cliff. He rose and walked back to the table. The surface was cold to the touch, scarred by knife marks and burn rings. He imagined the meals eaten here, the hands that had rested there, the eyes that had stared into the darkness beyond the door. He lifted the flashlight toward the shelf again and saw, among the rusted tins, a small wooden box wedged between them. He pulled it free. The lid creaked as he opened it. Inside were several tarnished coins, a compass with a cracked face, and a small envelope folded neatly in half. He turned it over and saw a single name written on the back. Ada. The paper nearly crumbled in his hands as he opened it. The letter was short, written in elegant cursive that slanted slightly to the right. He could not understand every word, but he caught enough to grasp its meaning. If you read this, I did not return. Forgive me. I was free here. A simple farewell. No plea for rescue, no apology for leaving. Just an acceptance that life, or what remained of it, had found its ending within these walls. Bill folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the box. For a moment he just stood there, staring at the objects as though they might speak. The stillness pressed closer. The temperature seemed to drop. He realized he was holding his breath. When he exhaled, his breath fogged faintly in the beam of the light. He turned his attention to the floor. The boards were uneven, and when he stepped near the table, one of them gave slightly beneath his weight. He crouched down, shining the light along the seam. The edges were too regular, too clean. It wasn't decay. It was a hidden panel. He took out his pocket knife and slid the blade beneath it, prying gently until the board lifted with a dry crack. Beneath it lay a small compartment filled with darkness. He lowered the flashlight into the opening. Inside, he saw a metal tin about the size of his hand. He reached down and pulled it out. The lid was sealed with rust, but it opened with a soft snap. Inside lay several bullets, corroded, but unmistakable. He stared at them, a strange chill crawling up his spine. Whoever had lived here had not come simply to find peace. He had expected pursuit, maybe even prepared for it. These weren't the tools of a hermit. They were the relics of a man waiting for something that never came. He set the tin aside and replaced the floorboard, pressing it back into place. The silence that followed was heavy, like the pause after a prayer. He sat back against the wall, the beam of his flashlight trembling as it reflected off the wood and stone. Everything around him felt charged with meaning. The coat wasn't just clothing. It was the weight of a vanished life. The table wasn't just furniture. It was an altar to endurance. Even the dust seemed alive, carrying the breath of whoever had lived here a century ago. He picked up the journal again and turned to the later pages. The handwriting grew shakier, the lines shorter. One entry read, "The snow does not stop. Food is gone, but I am no longer afraid." Another, written days later, simply said, "Silence keeps me warm." The final entry was a single line, written in ink that had bled through the page. "I will wait for spring, even if it never comes." Bill closed the book slowly. The weight of it in his hands felt disproportionate to its size, as though it carried not paper, but a soul. He imagined the man lying on that bed, the journal beside him, listening to the wind, He wondered how long it had taken for the mountain to swallow him completely. He remained there for a long time, letting the silence fill him. Outside, the wind moaned faintly through the narrow cracks around the door, carrying the scent of pine and ice. He turned off the flashlight for a moment, wanting to feel the darkness fully. It wasn't frightening. It was absolute, yes, but it was honest. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man out of place. He felt like someone who had found the shape of his own loneliness reflected perfectly around him. When he switched the light back on, he took out his own small notebook from his pack. The pages were clean, the pen ink still fresh. He began to write, his handwriting slow and uncertain. My name is Bill Hansen. I found your home. I think I understand why you came here. I think I understand why you stayed. He paused, looking around the room, then continued. I used to rescue people. But maybe not everyone who disappears wants to be found. He stopped writing and let the pen fall. The words on the page looked stark and unfamiliar, as if written by another man. Yet they felt right. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and listened. Somewhere deep within the mountain, water dripped rhythmically, the slow heartbeat of stone. Hours passed without him noticing. When fatigue finally pulled at him, he lay down on the bed, pulling an old blanket across his chest. The fabric was brittle and smelled of dust, but its weight was comforting. Through the cracks in the wall, thin strands of light from a rising moon filtered in, painting the room in silver. He turned on his side, one hand resting on the journal beside him, and thought of Mary. She had always said that silence could heal if a person let it. He had never believed her until now. As he drifted toward sleep, he imagined the man from 1916 writing by candlelight, his pen scratching softly across the page. Two strangers, a century apart, both seeking the same thing. Forgiveness, not from the world, but from themselves. The wind outside shifted, carrying a long, low sigh through the cracks. It almost sounded like breathing. Bill opened his eyes once, half expecting to see someone sitting at the table across the room, but there was only the faint shimmer of dust drifting in the flashlight beam. He smiled faintly, not out of fear, but out of recognition. Some presences didn't haunt. They kept watch. He closed his eyes again, and the mountain settled around him. The cold air no longer felt intrusive. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt earned. When he finally slept, he dreamed not of fire, but of snow falling quietly outside a wooden door. The man from the journal stood there, looking out into the storm, his face calm, almost peaceful. And beside him, Bill stood too, their breaths merging into the same thin mist before disappearing into the night. When Bill woke, the world was pale and still. The first gray light of morning seeped through the cracks in the wooden walls, turning the dust that floated in the air into slow, shimmering threads. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. The ceiling above him was rough timber. The smell of dry wood and age filled his lungs, and then memory returned with the weight of truth. He was inside the mountain, inside the hidden house carved into its bones. The flashlight beside him had gone dim during the night. Its final glow stretched weakly across the room, revealing the faint shapes that had become familiar. Table, bed, shelf, the outline of a door that seemed to belong to another century. He lay there, listening. The silence was no longer oppressive. It felt almost companionable, like the steady breathing of something immense and patient. For the first time in many years, he had slept without dreams of fire, the faces that usually haunted his sleep. Mary's soft smile fading in hospital light, the boy trapped beneath the roof. The flash of collapsing beams had stayed away. In their place, there was only quiet. It wasn't happiness, not quite. It was something gentler, a fragile balance between sorrow and peace. He sat up slowly, his muscles stiff from the cold, and rubbed his hands together for warmth. The house creaked faintly, responding to his movement, as if it remembered what it meant to have life inside it again. The old blanket fell from his shoulders, stirring a puff of dust into the air. He swung his legs to the floor and stood, stretching until his back popped. Through the narrow slit of the doorway, he could see the faint gleam of daylight reflecting off the stone outside. He looked around, absorbing the details once more. The wooden table with its dark stains, the shelf lined with relics of survival, the faded coat hanging near the door. None of it seemed eerie anymore. Each object was a piece of a man's endurance, evidence that he had fought for his solitude as fiercely as others fought for freedom. Bill found himself whispering into the quiet. "You built yourself a home, didn't you?" His voice sounded strange after so much silence, swallowed almost instantly by the thick air. He turned toward the table and saw the journal lying where he'd left it. The cracked leather looked almost soft in the dim light, the ink faintly glinting on its cover. He picked it up and thumbed through the pages again. The handwriting, once foreign, now felt familiar, like the rhythm of someone he'd known in another life. He stopped near the end, at the final entry. The ink there was smudged, as if the writer's hand had trembled. "I will wait for spring, even if it never comes." He traced the words with his finger and thought about what kind of man could write that sentence with acceptance instead of despair. Whoever he was, he had found a form of peace that Bill had been chasing for decades without realizing it. He wondered if the man had died here, quietly, one winter morning like this, his breath fading as gently as the wind outside. The mountain had kept his secret all this time, holding it the way it held everything, without judgment, without hurry. Bill closed the book and slipped it back onto the table. He knew he couldn't stay much longer. The air was cold enough to numb his fingers, and his food was nearly gone. But something in him resisted the idea of leaving just yet. There was one thing left to do. One question that had begun to take shape in his mind since the night before. He wanted to know where the man's story had ended, truly ended. He packed his bag slowly, folding the old blanket and leaving it at the foot of the bed. He felt like a guest saying goodbye. Before stepping out, he paused by the writing on the wall, the words drawn in charcoal so many years ago. "Don't look for an exit. Look for silence." They no longer felt like a warning. They were an invitation, perhaps even a blessing. He touched the letters lightly with his fingertips, then pushed open the door. Outside, the cold bit at his face, sharper now that the sun was climbing higher over the ridgeline. The light was blinding after the dimness of the interior. He squinted toward the valley below and saw the faint glimmer of a frozen stream cutting through the trees. Somewhere down there, the man from 1916 had marked a place on his map, a place he called Lukur. Bill didn't know what the word meant, but it sounded like a name or a promise. He pulled the folded map from his pocket, the one he'd found inside the journal, and studied the hand-drawn lines. The markings were faint, but clear enough. The location was only a few miles below the cliff. He started the descent carefully, each step deliberate on the uneven rock. The snow from earlier storms lingered in patches, hard as glass under his boots. His breath rose in steady clouds, and the air smelled of pine and stone. The mountain was quiet, except for the occasional groan of ice breaking somewhere in the distance. Hours passed as he made his way downward, the cliffs giving way to forest, the forest to a small, open clearing where sunlight filtered through the thin canopy. There, among the long shadows of trees, he saw it, a small wooden cross leaning slightly, half swallowed by the earth. The wood was dark with age, the engraving almost gone. He approached slowly, his chest tightening. At its base lay a rusted tin box, almost identical to the one he'd found beneath the floorboards of the house. He knelt and brushed the dirt away, fingers trembling as he lifted the lid. Inside was another folded sheet of paper, brittle and yellow. The handwriting was faint, but unmistakably the same. Here I stopped. Here I became the silence. No name, no date, nothing more. Just those words. Bill closed his eyes and bowed his head. He didn't need more than that. The man hadn't been forgotten. The mountain had remembered him, and now so would he. He sat there for a long time, listening to the faint whisper of wind through the trees. In that sound, he could almost hear a heartbeat, a rhythm older than language, older than grief. It felt like the same stillness he had felt inside the hidden house, but now it lived within him too. He realized that the man from the journal hadn't been seeking death at all. He'd been seeking peace, and in finding it, he had left behind a map for anyone brave enough to follow. When Bill finally stood, the sunlight had begun to fade again, the air turning colder. He looked up toward the cliff face far above, where the hidden door was no longer visible from this distance. He wondered if he would ever find it again, or if it would vanish back into myth once he left. Part of him hoped it would. Some places deserved to stay hidden, untouched by curiosity. He made his way back up the slope until the trees began to thin. When he reached the edge of the ridge, he paused and looked back one last time. The cross was a tiny mark in the vastness of the landscape, almost invisible, yet its presence filled the valley with meaning. He whispered, "Rest easy, my friend," and turned toward the path that would take him down the mountain. By the time he reached his truck, the sky was deep blue and streaked with the first traces of evening. The world below seemed distant and unreal, as if he had spent not one night, but a lifetime above it. He sat behind the wheel for a long moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, before starting the engine. The familiar hum of the motor sounded foreign after so much silence. The drive back was slow. The road twisted through the hills, sometimes disappearing behind snowdrifts, sometimes opening into long stretches of pale light. Bill's thoughts drifted between past and present, between the man from the journal and his own years of searching. He thought of Mary again, of the promise he'd made her to stop putting himself in danger. For the first time, he understood what she had really wanted for him, not safety, but peace. He smiled faintly at the thought and whispered into the empty cab, "I think I found it, Mare. Not where I expected, but I found it." When he finally reached the outskirts of town, night had fallen. The streetlights glowed weakly, halos of gold in the fog. He parked in front of his house and sat there with the engine running, staring at the dark windows. It struck him how different this silence felt from the one he'd left behind days ago. This silence wasn't hollow anymore. It was alive, full of memory and meaning. Inside, the house greeted him with its familiar scent of wood and dust. He set down his pack, removed his coat, and went to the mantel where Mary's photograph still stood. He placed his hand on the frame and said softly, "You were right about silence." Then he turned on the small lamp by the window and sat down with his notebook. He opened it to the same page where he'd last written inside the mountain. The ink there was dry, the words rough and uneven. "My name is Bill Hanson. I found your home." He took up his pen again and added, "I also found your resting place. You were right to stay. Some peace can't be carried down from the mountain. It has to be found there." He paused, tapping the pen against the paper, then continued, "I spent my life saving people. But maybe what we call saving isn't always salvation. Maybe some people don't need to be pulled back. They need to be left in their quiet. You taught me that." He stopped again, thinking of the old journal and its words. Then he wrote one last line. "You waited for spring. I think I'll wait for silence." He closed the notebook and leaned back in his chair. Outside, The night wind brushed against the house, carrying the faint scent of pine. Somewhere, far away, beyond the noise of the town, the mountains stood unchanged, their shadows vast and unmoving. He felt a strange urge to hear another voice, not to speak, but to be heard. He went to the corner where his old field radio still sat, covered in a film of dust. He wiped it clean with his sleeve and turned it on. The static filled the room instantly, raw and alive. He adjusted the frequency, listening as the noise rose and fell, the sound of 1,000 empty channels overlapping. Then he pressed the transmitter button and spoke into the microphone, his voice low but steady. "If anyone's out there, this is rescuer William Hanson." He hesitated, then smiled faintly. "I'm all right." "Repeat. I'm all right." He released the button and waited. The static rolled on, endless and indifferent. A minute passed, then 2. He was about to turn it off when a faint crackle broke through the noise, followed by a whisper so soft it might have been the wind. "Copy that, William. Copy." He froze, the hairs rising on his arms. The sound faded as quickly as it came, replaced again by the hum of the universe. But he didn't doubt what he'd heard. He smiled, not with surprise, but with gratitude. Maybe it was just interference. Maybe it was memory. Or maybe, somewhere in that vast unseen space, a signal had finally found its echo. He switched off the radio and sat in the dark for a long while, listening to the silence that followed. It was no longer empty. It was full of the mountain's breath, of Mary's laughter echoing faintly in his mind, of a stranger's voice carried across a century. He realized then that he hadn't brought the mountain back with him. It had never left. Outside, the wind rose once more, sweeping across the rooftops and carrying a whisper down from the high places, where snow lay deep and time held still. And though he couldn't see them from his window, he knew that behind those mountains, hidden inside the stone, there was still a door, still a house, still a silence waiting for whoever might come next. Bill leaned back, closed his eyes, and breathed in the quiet. It no longer felt like an ending. It felt like an answer. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are so many more stories to discover. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too powerful to keep to yourself.